Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Association Leadership Series. My name is James Donnelly, Chairman of the CASA Group, and I'm delighted to be joined again today by Donna DiMaggio-Berger, shareholder at Becker. Donna, welcome back.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here, James.
We have an action-packed agenda here. You know, it's that time of year to do hurricane prep, but it also happens to be a very active legislative season, and I kind of wanted to get the highlights of both of those in today. So buckle up, here we go. A reminder to our audience that you're welcome to do Q&A. I see you're already Q&Aing in, and I do keep an eye on that. And I won't necessarily answer your questions specifically, but I kind of group them together so I can present the ones that I think will answer the most to Donna. We also did submit some questions with your registration, which we're very grateful for. It really helps Donna and I kind of shape our comments. So keep doing that. Couple of reminders. We're always asked, is this recorded? Some of you are on a board and you're going to like what you're here today. And can your fellow board members see it? The answer is yes. By end of day today, you go to casagroup.com, resources, webinars, it will be up and available. I also want to remind you that Donna is very generous with her brilliance, but not necessarily giving us legal advice unless you're a client of Donna's, in which case this is a great economic way to listen to her.
Oh, thanks for that, James. Appreciate that.
That's going to affect billings, but and also as we go through the program today, I know you're going to have questions, maybe not related to our topic. You can always send them in to info@casagroup.com and we will get you where you need to go. So with that, we get the preliminaries out of the way. Donna, I got to tell you before we get going, I listened to your podcast, Take It to the Board, the other day, which I loved. And I think it was a milestone, speaking of milestones, in your podcast. So what number was it? And I know people who are on this webinar would like to hear your podcast as well. How do they access it?
Well, first of all, you were my first guest on the podcast, which is called Take It to the Board. Starting out with these webinars, I thought it was only fair to have you on first, and your episode is still one of our highest listened to episodes. We just reached our 50th milestone. I've been so lucky to have so many incredible guests on the show, including engineers, reserve specialists, bankers, real property experts. Just recently had a pickleball episode. So for those of you who are thinking about putting in pickleball courts, we actually have the sound of the game going on. So it was our 50th episode at the podcast. It's our 50th year at Becker, and you can find the podcast on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and also just www.takeittotheboard.com. And I told you, James, I want you on the 100th episode. That'll be a nice bookend.
The first one was the best. I'm just kidding. I'm just going to poll question one, Mariness. I know we and our audience will want to know how many condominium, how many HOA, how many co-ops we have. It kind of contextualizes some of the answers. So let's put that up there. And Donna, I want to jump right in on the legislative update. This SB 4D, what's sadly really called the Surfside bill, has had what we would talked about before as the glitch bill. Maybe just run through the highlights of the adjustments. And I do want to pre-frame it because we've got comments back from our clients already saying they haven't done enough, they didn't do it right. I think it's a process. They put out a bill. This bill makes it a bit better, and I'm sure there will be other improvements. But why don't you kind of walk us through the highlights of Senate Bill 154, commonly known as the glitch bill, and I already have some questions on the board about it. So
right. So it's I'm going to just dig into it. And by the way, sometimes you want the legislature doing less, not more. But for sure, SB 154 is the glitch bill that passed this session. It has not, as of yesterday, it was not yet signed by the governor, but we absolutely believe he will sign it. It's a 77-page bill. Now, normally I don't work off bullet points, James, but with these bills, I'm going to, because there's a lot of meat here. So one of the questions that under SB 4D, which was the predecessor, was what constitutes a height? Remember, we're talking about 3 stories that the milestone inspections and the structural integrity reserve study apply to. So one of the first things that SB 154, the glitch bill, did was refer questions of building height to the Florida Building Code. So if you have any questions, work with council. They're going to look at the Florida Building Code and hopefully give you an answer. Another really important change was this bill excluded insurance premiums from that calculation of whether or not your budget exceeds 115%, which is really 15% for your assessments for the prior year. Now, this is a big thing, and I know you're experiencing it at Castle too, James, is that all of these assessments are going up so high. Oh, do you want to take a look at the poll before I continue?
I just shared it so that people can see. It looks like we're heavily condominium. I'd expect that with some of this legislation, but since I have your attention on the 115, if you could just maybe explain a little bit about that. The law before this basically said if a condominium budget went up 115% of the prior year, it could be challenged by the owners. Now they're taking insurance premium out of that calculation because that alone can do that. And did I get that right?
Absolutely. And before it excluded, James, reserve funds from that calculation, but it didn't exclude insurance premiums. And what we've seen go on in the state of Florida in the last 2 years, it has bumped up all of these association budgets. Now, in all the years I've been representing associations, never had any challenge to budgets. Recently had 2 challenges. Those, again, it's because of the huge increases. So the glitch bill does address that. And I think that's a really welcome change. So speak to council about that. Couple other changes. Milestone inspection may be provided by a team of professionals with an architect or engineer acting as a registered design professional. So they've kind of expanded it now. That could include engineering interns. Again, this all gets back to that issue of supply and demand, right? Are there going to be enough architects and engineers? So now they're saying they're acknowledging that there's going to be a team of people. The bill adds substantial structural weakness to the definition of substantial structural deterioration. Now let's talk about some deadlines. If a building reached 30 years of age before July 1st, 2022, the building's initial milestone must be performed by December 31st, 2024. If a building reaches 30 years of age on or after July 1st, 2022, but before December 31st, 2024, that building's initial milestone must be performed before December 31st, 2025. By the way, if you're madly scribbling these deadlines, go back and watch the video because we got to rush through this. One of the other changes was the local authority may determine that proximity to salt water requires a building to perform its milestone initial inspection by its 25th year of age. Remember, James, previously it was 3 miles of the coastline. Now we're talking about proximity to salt water. The local authority may extend the deadline for good cause if the association has entered into a contract for the milestone and it cannot be completed by the deadline. This does not mean wait till the last minute to sign a contract, but it does mean there's a little wiggle room there. Again, getting back to that supply and demand issue. Here's another huge one, and I know you and I have talked about this, James. The local authority may accept a 40 or 50-year certification report performed before July 1st, 2022, if it substantially complies with the milestone inspection requirements. Now, that's only going to really apply to Broward and Miami-Dade associations, because those were the only 2 counties that were previously requiring these certifications. But a lot of buildings said, hey, we just did our 40 and 50. Is that going to meet the requirements? And the answer is that this glitch bill provides is it just might. If you rely on, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Reserve studies.
Sorry?
There's a question here that says, can they use reserve studies in lieu of these milestone inspections? And you're saying they can use the 30 or 40 and 50 year inspections, but they cannot use reserve studies in lieu of a milestone inspection.
Right. So the person questioning jumped us ahead, but you can use your 40 or 50 year certification in lieu of the phase 1 visual inspection for SERS. And we're going to get into that. So if you do use a 40 or 50 year certification, James, that creates the baseline. So your 10-year subsequent inspection dates to that 40 or 50 year. Okay. That's important to remember. The association must notify unit owners within 14 days after receipt of notice from a local authority that the milestone must be performed, and they must give the date that the milestone must be performed. So the glitch bill is basically saying, hey, if you get that notice from your local, authority, you can't just stick it in the association records. You have to tell people, we've gotten this notice within 14 days of getting it. You got to let your members know that you've gotten this notice from the city, and here's when the deadline is to perform it. That notice can be hand delivered, mailed, or emailed to owners who have consented to electronic transmission. Phase 1, James, must be completed within 180 days after receiving notice from the local authority. If a phase 2 is needed, the architect or engineer must submit phase 2 within 180 days after submitting the phase 1, with a timeline for completion of phase 2. The takeaway is they want you to keep people informed, and there's deadlines to do it. And we're almost done. 2 more bullet points. Within 45 days from receiving the inspection report from the engineer or architect, the association must mail, hand deliver, or email, or fax a summary of the report to the unit owners, posted on the website if they're required to have a website. And this report's also accessible to renters. And then lastly, when it comes to the inspections, if the inspection report discovers damage, the deadline for commencing required repairs is 365 days after receipt of the report, or earlier if the local government adopts ordinance requiring a shorter deadline. So that, in a nutshell, is what the glitch bill 154 did with regard to milestone inspections.
Great summary. There's some questions. I think we can just rapid fire them here. Proximity to salt water is really being punted to the local building authority. That was one of the questions. And there's 2 questions on the board about under 3 stories. And number 1, I believe under 3 stories, it doesn't apply.
Right.
But another, which I believe was clarified, was if you are under 3 stories, can you still waive reserves? And I believe the answer is you can under 3 stories.
So you can, but when we get into the reserve section next, they have increased the percentage needed to waive reserves for those buildings less than 3 stories, or for even 3 stories and higher for the non-structural integrity reserves. It used to be a majority of the people present and voting to waive reserves or partially fund. It's now been increased to a majority of the total voting interest.
Okay, and there's a couple of questions on the board about what's public. Like this question may be coming from a realtor. You want to buy into a building, and so you want to know the status of all of these things. Is the information you've summarized available to the public, or is it private to the association?
So the association, if they're required to have a website, they have to post a summary of the inspection. But this information is also accessible to purchasers and renters. So you'll probably, if you have a website, you will put this on the password protected portion of the site. But again, I ran through the notice requirements. You have to get it out there to the owners and the residents. And so people can make document inspections request as well for this information.
Okay.
So do you want to go through the reserves quickly in terms of the changes? Because this is significant too. So, I forgot to mention, by 12/31/24, the Florida Building Commission shall adopt rules to establish a building safety program. A lot in SB 154, it really brings the local authority and gives them more authority in this entire process. Okay. One of the things that I thought was a misstep with this glitch bill is that only a multi-condominium association operating at least 25 condominiums, James, is allowed to use a line of credit as an alternate funding source for reserves. Now, this is where lobbying comes in. Somebody lobbied on behalf of their one particular client that happened to be a multi-condominium that operates 25 condos, and that's the lucky group that gets to use a line of credit instead of funding reserves through the budget. I'm hoping that next session, this is going to be fixed, because that same opportunity should be given to all associations. You know as well as I do that people are struggling right now with trying to fund reserves, deal with insurance premiums. So that luxury should be afforded to all. So another thing that was changed, reserves must be funded based on the most recent structural integrity reserve study. That was always a huge change with SB 4D, is that a lot of associations, they never hired a reserve company to undertake a reserve study. 154 goes further and basically says reserves must be funded based on the most recent structural integrity reserve study. And remember, that's due by the end of 12/31/24. Elsewhere in the bill, it says 26 is the drop dead deadline. So work with council on those deadlines. You do not have to reserve for replacement costs for items for which the estimated remaining useful life exceeds 25 years or is not readily ascertainable. One example of that would be flooring. How do you ascertain that? Or it'll certainly normally, exceed 25 years, but that's only for replacement. You still must reserve for the deferred maintenance on those items. So I don't want people to get confused on that. Associations may add an inflation factor when determining reserves. That never happened before. And so when people said they were fully funded, you really weren't, because if you didn't take inflation into account, you probably weren't. I talked about the increase in the percentage needed to waive, which is now a majority of the total. The glitch bill added exterior doors into subsection G, reserve components, James, and it removed floor and foundation, but it added the word structure. So it's kind of a wash because your floor and foundation is part of the structure.
Windows.
I'm sorry?
Windows.
Windows are still in there, but the glitch bill did clarify that the reserve is only required for components for which the association is responsible under the declaration. So they did fix that problem. They fixed a few problems and they created a few others, but that's the nature of legislation. We're almost done. Here's a big one.
If the owner is responsible for the windows, then it's not part of the math.
Right, but every multifamily building, James, has common area windows.
That's true. Sorry, good point.
Right.
Yep.
So, you're still going to have to reserve for that and common area doors, but you don't have to do it for the units. One huge change here is it now allows a reserve specialist to perform the visual inspection of the SIRS study. Remember, a lot of reserve companies, when I was talking to clients and saying, hey, have you started your SIRS? They said, we can't find a reserve company that can do it because they don't have an architect or engineer. So again, getting back, the glitch bill really did try to address the supply and demand issue. And this, I think, is a positive change. And remember what I said previously, that if you have a 40 or 50-year certification report that substantially complies with these requirements, you may use that for the visual inspection instead of having to have the reserve specialist do it. Almost done. It adds language that a director's breach of the reserve mandates must be willful and knowing. Before, it was just you missed the deadline, you're in big trouble. Now it's knowing and willful. And then lastly, because I know you're itching to start talking, it gives the division jurisdiction under 718.1255 to oversee owner complaints related to this legislation. So if you're not maintaining and repairing your building, the division is going to oversee that. If you're not complying with the milestone inspection requirements, if you haven't given out notice, if you're not replying with your structural integrity reserve study, the division is going to get into the act. That's it.
Very good, very concise. I think a couple things. There's a question on the board. When should we start? And the answer is now, because you want to get that done. So the other thing is, I'm just getting them to shut the door here. We got a little side noise here. So yeah, let's keep going. I know we've got some HOA people on our call, but I also wanted to put up poll question 2 because I do want to get a feeling for our audience as to whether they have started the process that we just talked about timing. And also SB 360, the construction defect bill, Donna, it's not directly related to SB 154, but it has a connection that I wasn't aware of. If you could just kind of talk to briefly what the connection is, what is 360 and how does it relate to the 154.
Okay, I'm going to try to be as brief as possible. This bill became law on April 13th, and it's a very strange juxtaposition, in my opinion, when you look at that in connection with the condo safety law, because what 360 does is it has reduced the statute of repose from 10 years to 7 years now. It's important to remember that the statute of repose used to be 15 years in the state of Florida. Now we're down to 7. What's the statute of repose? That's the longest statute of limitations in Florida by which your board or you individually as a real property owner can pursue a contractor or a developer for hidden defects. Now, if you're thinking this only applies to new construction, it doesn't. It applies to all construction. So all of our listeners who are in the midst of concrete restoration projects, re-roofing projects, other repair and maintenance projects, this is going to impact you as well. And I know you're struggling to pay for those projects, but the Florida legislature has now reduced the statute of limitations from 10 years to 7. By the way, if you're looking to buy in another community, it's really going to impact you because in some HOAs, you've got developers that don't turn over for 7 or more years, and the association doesn't have standing to bring a cause of action for construction defects until turnover. So in some cases, you're out of time before you even get started. It's a really disappointing piece of legislation. And I will just say this, safe building, start with the people who build them and the people who repair them. That's how it starts.
That would apply to any, even a homeowner in an HOA, the law would be the same, correct?
Correct. And some defects, some defects, James, especially if you're dealing with concrete restoration, they're latent, they're hidden, they're not readily visible to the naked eye. My recommendation would be don't sit around thinking about your rights, given that they keep nibbling away at them. You need to make sure on these repair projects that you have an owner's rep, that you're working with your engineer and your architect, and you're making sure that the work is being done properly. You cannot just rely on the local building official to do that.
Okay, good. By the way, I just had them post the results of question 2. I'm actually very encouraged to see how many of our communities are already getting on this inspection process. So good for the boards that are on top of that. Okay, that segues well into the next bill, which is 919, which was a terrible bill that I know your group and our group did a lot of. I even spent some time in Tallahassee myself trying to get some of the terrible provisions of it, but maybe give us the 5 highlights of HB 919, which was called the HOA Reform Act, I believe.
And alternately known as the HOA Bill of Rights by Porras and Lopez. This actually originated because of the hammocks debacle in Miami-Dade, and so the intentions were to address that kind of fraud. Made a lot of changes. I'm going to hit the highlights. Number 1, homeowner association board meeting notices must now contain an agenda. So if you've just been putting up, hey, we're meeting at this date, time, and venue without an agenda, you need to start putting an agenda on your board meetings. It also addressed security deposits, James, specifically construction deposits. I have a lot of HOA clients that they do take a deposit when it comes to construction in the community. It may impact the roads, there may be construction debris, what have you. This bill requires the association to put those deposits in a separate account, which most of them do anyhow. Also, it gives a member the right to request an accounting, and within 7 days, the association must provide an accounting of what was done with that security deposit. My note on that is it doesn't say the member's request must be in writing, which I think is a problem. So if I'm just walking by and I say to the manager or a member of the board, hey, I want an accounting of my deposit, does that start the clock ticking? So I think that's a problem. Also, if you return the deposit in full, do you still need to present an accounting if somebody does it? So there's some gaps there. There is one huge problem with this bill, is it says that if a criminal charge is pending against an officer or director, he or she may not be appointed or elected to the board. That's not the problem. And may not have access to the official records of any association except pursuant to a court order. Now, to me, I think that presents a real due process problem. So we have a lot of people who own in multiple communities. I'm sure you've seen that, right? Does that mean that if there's a criminal charge pending, you haven't been convicted, but it's pending, and you own in this community in an HOA, but let's say you own a condo in Jacksonville or Naples or somewhere else, that means you cannot request to see your documents without a court order? I think that is a bit of overreach there, and they need to correct that. And then the other thing that they changed, James, was the 14-day notice prior to finding must include a description of the violation and the specific action required to cure the violation, if applicable. So remember that it's not just about, the finding committee's meeting 14 days hence. You also have to say what the violation is and the action taken to cure it.
Yeah, I think on this one, for our audience, boards, of course, especially on self-managed communities, this is going to require some adjustment in process. Obviously, the management companies are making the adjustments on a global basis, but I think these are important ones. I know you're very excited about HB 437 knowing as the AstroTurf bill, but I'm time limiting you. So tell us what the highlights of that bill and how it affects our audience.
Okay, that bill for condos, it adds Patriot Day as one of the days that they can fly their flag in addition to the US flag. They can fly that all the time. For HOA owners, it confirms that owners may fly up to 2 flags. I will just say that they added a first responder flag that includes law enforcement and paramedics and even people participating in a statewide urban search and rescue operation. I don't even know that these people have flags, but they added all of it. Lastly, the most important thing that really got me riled up was that an HOA may not restrict an owner from installing, displaying, or storing any items on a parcel which are not visible from the parcel's front or by an adjacent parcel. They didn't define what adjacent parcel means. If you look it up in the dictionary, there's a lot of different definitions, unless such items are prohibited by local ordinance or general law. The bill specifically mentions artificial turf, boats, flags, and RVs. One of the problems is in one section of 720, it says you can fly two flags. Now this section says you can fly as many flags as you want in the backyard as long as nobody can see it. My big problem with this is golf course communities where what you put in the back really does make a difference. And communities that may have protected conservation areas, as some of my communities do, where they are restricted under the declaration from erecting anything in that protected area. And this new law says, no, you can do whatever you want. So I find this law to be extremely problematic, and it came about because a legislator wanted to put our artificial turf, and they said no, and then he stuck it in his backyard, and somebody on the waterway ratted him out. But that's how bills are made. So
very interesting one to me as well. One of our jobs is covenant enforcement, and one of the reasons we live in HOAs and condos is because people can't just put whatever they want in their house, and this loosens that law. But it is what it is. It is now, or I don't know where that one's been signed, but it's supposed to be the law of the land.
Well, I would. One last thing, I wouldn't give up. Go to your local city commission and ask them to pass an ordinance, because it says if it's by ordinance, you can still do it. That's what I would do.
Okay. 837 civil remedies. This was really, I think, a well-intended attempt. We need to get insurance costs down, and tort reform is one way to do that. And so what they did for communities, multifamily communities, is they put in a provision that if you do X, Y, and Z, you have some protections against liability. What do you see as the highlights of this one?
Highlights is there's 7 measures you can take: security cameras at entry and exit, which record for 30 days, lighted parking lot, lighting in common areas from dusk till dawn, 1-inch deadbolt in a unit, locking devices on windows and doors, locked pool gate, safety training, a crime prevention assessment. There's 7 things you can do. The bill says that if a board substantially implements these measures, then they may enjoy protection from a premises liability claim due to third-party criminal activity. However, there is a wrinkle here. The wrinkle is it's not going to apply to every condominium, James, because it will apply to a condominium with at least 5 units on a particular parcel, and the parcel is defined as real property for which a distinct parcel ID number is assigned. So I hate to be, a storm cloud here, but this may not apply to you. Work with counsel to see if you meet the definition under this law. The other thing I would say is, can you install the cameras and the lighting, or is it a material alteration that requires membership approval? So work with counsel to decide if it's a material alteration, or you can do this as a board pursuant to this law without needing membership approval.
Yeah, I think that's going to be litigated. I would say my only comment on this is a serious attempt to limit, crazy lawsuits. And those 7 things are actually good security practices. So whether they're defensible or whether if they are material alterations, then obviously there'll be a process in whatever association you live in. But I think those are things that all communities could do, and it would improve security anyways.
Now,
okay.
They should fix slip and fall, because this is not going to help all those little slip and fall cases that our associations get almost every year.
Yeah, obviously we're copied on every one of those, and it literally is the #1 claim against associations, or slip and fall, which is also instructive of us to have an eye out for those potential risks. All right, last one. We're 3 minutes over my planned time here. You're doing great, Donna. The property insurance bill, there were a couple of things on flood insurance for HO6 policies. And there was also, I think, a provision in there that said mitigation procedures or steps taken by owners have to be considered in underwriting insurance premiums. So what stood out to you in the property insurance bill 799?
Well, to keep us on your timeline, I would just say this, that if you have a policy with Citizens, the HO6 policy, which is the interior policy, those owners are not going to be required to have flood coverage. The HO3 individual homeowner policy, which is a single family home, that they will still have to have. And then there's a staggered timeline in terms of individual ownership. If the structure is 600,000 or more, you're going to need flood by 24. And then by 2027, they want everybody to have flood insurance. I'm talking about the individual policies. But the main takeaway here is, if you're on the 12th floor in a condo building and you're with Citizens, you're not going to have to get flood coverage.
Well, that's good news, because I'm above the 6th floor, but okay.
But at least they'll cut down a little bit on the insurance cost for those folks.
By the way, I had a question. Is 837 Civil Remedies HOA or condo? It's all of the above, right?
All of the above. Yeah.
Okay. Hey, that was fantastic. I hope, by the way, I purposely stayed away from all legislation. We just picked the legislation that we think affects our condos and HOAs. I don't even want to get into some of the other legislation that passed this session, but I do want to flip gears here. Now is the time that we need to dust off our hurricane planning. And so Ness, I would like to put up question 3, just to get a feeling for where our audience is on their hurricane planning. Obviously, it's 2 weeks today, Donna, that the hurricane season officially starts. And our observation is that even though it's only 1 year ago, we tend to get rusty. We let the muscle atrophy a bit. And one of our intents of having this in May, of course, is to make sure our boards are thinking hurricane preparation. With respect to some management items, I'm going to go before I have some questions on that are legal in nature, Donna. I mean, I think the main thing is to have a plan, and we're asking that question now, and update the plan, because things do change from year to year. The other thing we highly recommend is just do a dry run. Okay, we got the 72-hour warning. What are we doing? And that's true of obviously managed and self-managed communities, but who owns what? Who's responsible? Who's making the decision? And the other thing that I highly recommend in the communities is you need some accountability. I highly recommend our boards establish, either within the board or amongst owners, a emergency response team. Who's doing what? It can't just be management. As you know, as the storm approaches, there will be limited management on site. And so anyways, those are kind of the reminders for everybody. I want to share the results of our planning to show the audience we're okay on this one. We got it up? Okay. Donna, one of the things that we've been stressing to our clients is you really have to know who the owners are, who the residents are, and especially in Moorbury Island, who's staying in the building. And so there's a data a process that we implement for our boards. What legal obligations do they have to know who's in the building, and especially if the decision is, on a barrier island to mandatory or otherwise to leave the building, what should we be thinking about from a liability perspective?
Well, there's nothing in the shared ownership statutes, James, that requires boards to keep track of their vulnerable residents or any residents, but certainly it's best practices, as you said, and working hand in hand with their management team to know, do we have anybody in the building who really needs to be on to have their electricity? So we need to make sure that we've got a generator that's going to kick in. The association's not a guarantor of safety or security. I say that with the caveat that you may have a strange set of documents that actually does make the association a guarantor of the resident's safety. And that is why you always want to look at your documents and say, what kind of obligations are they placing on the board? Because believe it or not, sometimes I come across a set of documents that has an outrageous amount of obligations placed on a volunteer board. So look there, speak to the council. I did want, you triggered something when you talked about the plan. The other thing I think is a really good idea, James, is to let your members know and your residents know ahead of time that if a state of emergency is declared, what that means in terms of the board's powers. Rather than explaining yourself after the fact, oh, you called a meeting and it was on 12-hour notice, or you passed the special assessment and you didn't follow the requirements in the documents. Tell them ahead of time. If a state of emergency is declared, these are the things we are entitled to do by law, including drying in and drying out your unit and assessing you owners for it.
Well, that's another good point. It's interesting. You and I talked about emergency powers until we put our audience to sleep, I think, during COVID, because it was such an effective tool to deal with the situation. But it is a good reminder that we do have emergency powers, when we have a hurricane coming through. And you spurred something in my back to the data side of it. We have a lot of snowbirds in Florida. And so the whole communication and the authority and then the keys to enter in the condos, you really have to think that whole process through. You have a building, there's 200 units, 50 of them, the owners don't even live in the country. What are you going to do? You have to kind of do scenarios there. I would like to put up question poll number 4, just to get an idea, Ness, of what our communities are doing with respect to data, and what you're doing with respect to my next topic, Donna, when that is, we highly recommend for certain vendor or tasks to pre-contract. Otherwise you're going to be way down the list. But I can tell you there's landscape companies and there's restoration companies that absolutely have programs where they will pre-contract and you will be in the top responding group. But what's your concern about those types of contracts, Donna? First of all, do you agree with me that that's a good idea? And 2, if you do that from a legal perspective, what concerns you?
Well, I 100% agree with you, James, that it makes sense given that we live in a geographically vulnerable area and we have a 6-month hurricane season here in Florida. Absolutely makes sense that when these contracts come up for renewal, whether it's landscaping, pool, absolutely even management, look at it and see what kind of provisions are there. I'll give you an example. Again, talking to your residents about expectations. Let's say you have security, valet, parking valet, front desk people. Well, those folks have to go home, right, to get ready for the storm. And then let's say the storm does impact your area. When can you reasonably expect them to come back? These are the type of things that you can put in your contract with them, where you have some reasonable expectations. You've got contractual obligations that you can then communicate to your owners. My experience has been that the residents, they're going to be freaked out regardless if a hurricane's coming, and specifically if it hits. But the more information you can give them, the better off it will be.
Yeah, we have a cadence where if we have the time, it's 96 72, 48, 24 are kind of our standard. We already know what we need to communicate. Obviously, you have to roll with the punches as things come up. But you do, as part of this plan we're talking about, which you referenced with respect to vendors, you do want to communicate, in an HO, when will the gates be put up? When will the security team leave the guardhouse? When will the maintenance team leave your condominium? And for the most part, they do. I will tell you, we've run into this repeatedly because there's all kinds of workers' comp issues and worker safety issues. But we as a firm, for the most part, have agreed, to take on some workers' comp risk if a maintenance person wants to stay, especially in a high-rise building. And what really compelled us to do that was when we learned that, in fact, our teammate was safer in the building than they were in their own home. So it made a lot of sense. But my major point here is, let's make sure we're communicating. Like, the elevators will be shut off and moved off the ground floor, and you won't be able to use elevators. As long as that's communicated, basically it's on your resident after that.
Well, the restoration contract too, James, everyone is going to need to call a company to come out and dry out the units, right? Have that contract looked at ahead of time. A lot of times they're just picking up the phone. There's no contract in place. Remember, I said emergency powers allows the board to assess the owners directly for the dry in, dry out costs. But often they're the board or the manager is the one who calls the restoration company. So the restoration company goes looking for payment from the association. You need to work out all these details ahead of time, including how quickly can the restoration company get out there, because the quicker you can, dry everything out, tarp the roof, make it waterproof, the better it's going to be.
Yeah, let's share the results for question 4. I think the other thing about contracting is you're locking in pricing. And you can imagine if some of these vendors have 10 accounts asking for it, and they only have the capacity for one, the price, I know there are some anti-gouging laws and whatnot, but at least you have certainty about that. You mentioned emergency powers again, and I don't want to go into that as a separate topic, but how would our boards learn what emergency powers they do have if we get a hurricane coming through?
Well, if you're my client, you'll get it from the desk of message. But no, I mean, all joking aside, ask your counsel, before now that storm season's coming up, please explain to us what powers, what authorities we have under the statute. There's emergency language in 718, 719, and 720. So you should know ahead of time what are the parameters within which you're going to be operating if the governor declares a state of emergency, which, as you know, we can expect that to happen a couple times during every hurricane season. The one thing I would say also is that people who decide to stay in the building, regardless of a mandatory evacuation order, the emergency powers make it clear that those people are staying at their own risk. If they are harmed or killed, they cannot go back after the association. Well, their survivors and family members cannot go back and say, you should have gone in and hauled my mom or dad out. That is not the association's responsibility. I think it's important when the board communicates to people that they let them know that that's the case, that they're under a mandatory evacuation order. Emergency Power Association is not going to be responsible. And like you said, James, all of the systems are going to be shut down. Electricity, the elevators, everything.
Yeah. Okay. We got a lot of stuff here. The other couple of things I wanted to mention were supplies. Supplies will be cut off quickly, and especially if you're on the barrier island. In fact, one of the things I don't have in my notes, but one of the things that we have found, especially new boards on barrier islands, is they lift the bridges and you can't get on or off. And even after the storm, you can only get back on if you have the card that says you're a resident, but you don't get that unless you won't have it unless you go get that in advance. So if you're living on a barrier island, you better make sure you get the appropriate, whatever the municipality requires to get back on that barrier island afterwards.
Well, our residents have to be partners in the process, just like with safety and security. When you tell people to lock their doors and lock their cars, they say, oh, my car's been broken in. Well, you left the keys, left it open, and you left personal property in the car. It's the same thing with hurricane preparation. You have to be partners. As you said, you have to make arrangements to evacuate when it's mandatory. If it's not mandatory, then you have to take steps to keep yourself safe as well.
Agreed. The next item I have is a reminder to our audience that in today's day and age, you have photography and video that can completely verify what the status of the building is before and obviously after. I highly recommend that you do that. And I think that's kind of a management issue, but the one I wanted to ask you about was, we have so many projects going on in our buildings in South Florida, and with, you know, the new SB 4D 154 laws, we're going to have more. What obligation do our boards have in terms of open projects in process? What do they need to do to protect the project they're building, and most importantly, their residents, if they're in the middle of something and a storm comes, Donna?
It's back to the contract that they signed with that contractor, James. So make sure when you're signing those repair contracts that there are provisions in there that would require the contractor to safely store or remove any construction materials or debris that might become projectiles during a storm. So again, unless you're doing something in December and it's going to be completed in December, if you have any sort of project that is going to be a multi-month, even multi-year project, you're going to want to make sure that the contract has those provisions where it puts the burden on the contractor to safely store all materials. And to, if you're in the midst of a roof, a lot of roofers will tell you that they can take steps to secure that roof before the storm blows in.
Well, that's why it's so important on the contract. Since, it's interesting, I'm absolutely not an advertisement for the legal community in our industry, but I'm thinking of the dynamics of all of the laws that just changed. And if I'm a board member, I just don't take that on. The interpretation of same on, like, go get an interpretation. And it's not like you have to go every day. You go and say, okay, how does this apply, and get some guidance. Similarly, as we're going through these contracts, especially the big ones, and especially as it relates to renovating a building or future-oriented contracts, I think it's worth the whatever it costs to have a review of the contract. Okay, I wanted to talk to you about money. It is such a tough time. I really am so empathetic to our of course, our boards, because they're the ones that have to put the budget together to deal with everything we've been talking about. But, you can imagine the fixed income owner who's lived in their unit for 20 years and now you're getting these dramatic increases. And to have the reserve inspection component come at the same time of historic increases in insurance, it's terrible. I mean, people are having to move out of their homes. But as board members, we have a fiduciary responsibility to comply with the law and take care of our buildings. And that involves cash management. And one of the things I think we need to talk about and plan for is, if we get any kind of event during hurricane season, of course, you want to make sure all your insurance is in place. In fact, I hadn't mentioned that, but last year at this time, because we didn't have so much legislation, we had Andrea Northrup on. She gave us some insurance guidance, but at a minimum, have a look at the currency of your insurance policy and review it with your insurance agent. But all of them have deductibles, and these deductibles can be huge numbers. And Donna, to me, you need to fund that before the insurance kicks in. How are you going to do that? And simplistically, cash in the bank, special assessment, line of credit, or I don't know whether we're allowed to do it anymore. Can we borrow from reserves for a deductible given the new law? So I've given you a lot there, but from a perspective, what should our boards be thinking about in terms of how they're going to fund insurance deductibles coming into the storm season?
And I know many of them are looking at huge 10% or more deductibles. So this is going to be a significant amount they're going to have to come up with in a very short period of time. The one thing they can't do, James, is they will not be able to borrow from the structural integrity reserves, what we call the subsection G reserves that I talked about earlier. You cannot, that's non-waivable. So you're not going to be able to tap into that. But if you keep other reserves, a lot of my clients do have a reserve for insurance premiums. So, again, it's going to be all about planning for that. I hate to use the pun, rainy day, but you will need to have That's where a line of credit comes in. That's where having reserves for those uninsured losses will come in. Of course, what also ties into it is what do your regular delinquencies look like? Do you have a late policy where you've got some people that have gone months or years without paying? If that's the case, you can no longer afford to have a very lax collection policy. You need to be able to get as close to 100% collectible on your regular assessments and special assessments as possible. You can never assure, that's never a guarantee, James, but a lot goes into that policy. And remember, the law changed last year. I think it was last year or the year before that requires that 30-day notice before you can even send it to the attorney. And then we have additional time periods that we have to comply with. So it becomes very attenuated in terms of getting money in the door. With special assessments, talk to counsel about how to structure a special assessment, in order to get some cash in. You may want to do on sale clause, but again, there's pros and cons to that. That has to be worded very carefully.
A couple of questions on the board about, can we create and fund insurance deductible reserve? Obviously, it's different than the reserves we've been talking about, but I think the answer is yes, you can.
A lot do.
Yeah, a lot do. The challenge we're having right now is it would be the third big item that we would be considering. But I think at a minimum, and you mentioned collections. I remember in the Great Recession, we never tracked accounts receivable across our 500 communities. The ones that had challenges we worked with, but we put in a metric to really track at a global level what's happening. Are people paying their maintenance or not? And for the last several years, it's been unbelievable. People are paying their maintenance. And for the first time since the Great Recession, we've seen it tick up. So I want to reinforce your comment that now is not the time to be tolerant of non-payment. Yeah, we, the communities, need the cash. Okay, wow, we're flying through this, and this is good. By the way, I think the line of credit is a great idea. And again, it's something, we have some expertise and some great banks to work with. Obviously, the attorneys will look at that document, but I think a hurricane is situational. You don't know whether it's going to come or it's not. So, planning for a rainy day by putting a whole bunch of cash away may not make as much sense as matching the need with the vehicle, and the vehicle, a line of credit or something, is something that's situational as well. Anyways, enough about that. The storm's come. It's gone. We have to come out and assess the damage. What are the key things that we need to do post-storm, from inspection, from making sure our owners get back in, from getting an adjuster to work with the insurance companies?
The very first thing is work with your local building official to determine if the building's safe to re-enter, okay? Because under the emergency powers, you can prevent re-entry, but you need the local authority to tell you, yes, this building's not safe to enter. That's number one. Number two, realize that your immediate need is to stop further damage to the property, right? And that damage would be the elements, that the building's exposed to the elements. That means signing a limited contract just to protect the building, put a tarp on, close up any damaged, blown out windows. That does not mean signing a $12 million repair contract right then and there without having it reviewed by counsel, without doing your vetting of that contractor. So understand that your immediate need is much narrower in scope, and then you're going to want to do all the things that constitute best practices in terms of vetting your contractor, having legal review it. Those would be my two main takeaways. The third one is know that the insurance company is going to send out their own adjuster, and that adjuster's goal is to find as little damage as possible, to say that most things were pre-existing or failure to maintain or what have you. So you really do need to have your own adjuster, so called a public independent adjuster, to come out and tell you what's damaged, give you an idea of what your claim should be. You really do, because you need to be on a level playing field. And if you're only working with the insurance company's adjuster, you have to understand they're representing the insurance company, not you, the insured.
It goes back to, I think, the real importance of making sure you've got video and photography, and even drones are so inexpensive now. I mean, you can get your whole building videoed so that there's no dispute. There'll always be some dispute with insurance companies, but I think that's a really important step. Just have a couple of minutes left on, and here we are with an audience of mostly board members. They take on such responsibility, especially this day and age. What are the types of things as it relates to hurricanes we should be very careful of as boards in terms of steps we take to limit our own liability? I know we have great D&O policies, and we're incredibly grateful for all the leadership our boards give. But, there's kind of that common sense business judgment rule that you always talk about. Maybe just a couple closing comments on what our board should be thinking of, even, as it relates to liability.
Well, I know a lot of boards right now, James, are considering, should they self-insure? And what if we go, and even in the smaller communities, what if we go to everybody and ask them, are they okay with us not getting a certain level of coverage? When you talk about liability, that really scares me, because number one, your documents may require a certain level. The statute says that the association must use its best efforts to obtain adequate coverage. But I think when you're talking about liability, the vulnerable points are, did the board obtain sufficient coverage, right? Were they reasonable? Was coverage available in the marketplace? This gets very complicated. So I would say to the board members listening, if you're even considering underinsuring or self-insuring, which is really not an option, but you need to get with counsel, and you need to get with your insurance agent. And a lot of them are also doing this loss assessment, like a risk assessment, to see how much coverage do they actually need. Do they need coverage for a 1 in a 10,000 year storm? So there are companies out there that can help them kind of, it's not really a legal issue. It's an issue of assessing the risk and then trying to make the best coverage decisions possible. Getting back to your original point, having a plan, an emergency plan in place is really helpful. And then when identifying your vulnerable residents, and at least if you've got those emergency family contacts, that you can contact those folks and let them know, hey, we're shutting down the building, mom or pop or grandma or grandpa are still in the unit. Those are good steps to take.
That's excellent. Well, let me kind of tie this in a bow, Donna. We really wanted to address, because there was significant legislative change in Tallahassee as it relates to our industry. Our intent here wasn't, of course, a deep dive into any of those bills, but kind of a highlight to think about. There will be lots of correspondence, including from your firm, that kind of does a deep dive into each one of these bills and how it impacts us. And then the second part of today was really reminder, now is the time. We have to get ready. We don't want a June 2nd hurricane to come through and go, boy, we should have done the video. We should have got our vendors lined up. We should have checked with our insurance company. Now's the time to do that. Obviously, work with your manager, your management company, and your attorney, and we will be all set. So, Donna, thanks again. You're always a delight and informative to our audience, and I enjoy it. So, and to our audience, thank you for all you're doing. It's crazy times in the association leadership time, so business. So this is why we do a leadership series. So until next time, I think my partner Craig Vaughn will be back in June, and Donna, if you're available, I think we'll do it in July. So thank you, everybody. Have a great week. Go get ready for hurricane. Bye-bye.